for my September wrap-up video. I'm feeling a bit under the weather today, so I'm gonna film from my bed. My voice may sound a little off, that's why, but I still felt good enough to film and really wanted to film, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. But today I'm going to be talking about my September wrap-up and kind of how I want to reframe doing my wrap-ups from how I've previously done them. I just want to talk about my reading habits and how fast I read, so on and so forth. So this past month I was doing a fundraising project for the Trevor Project. It was a back-to-school reading challenge, and you basically had to read like 20 minutes a day, which I didn't really do 20 minutes a day. I think the thing that put me off of that was it had you log your minutes, and it said blank out of 600 minutes. So the goal was 600 minutes in my head, which I ended up crushing like halfway through the month. My total for the month ended up being 1,058 minutes. I did find it interesting to log and track my reading minutes just because I am kind of a slower reader, I guess you could say. I'm not really in it to like read as much as I can as fast as I can, although that's how it used to be on BookTube, just because I felt the need to keep up with other booktubers doing like 8 to 10 books a month, or even just 5 to 8 books a month seemed like a real challenge for me at times. I've come to realize with my full-time job and, you know, just my life and other things going on, reading is something I do for fun, and I don't want to read if I don't feel like reading. So I read a lot, obviously, as you can tell by the number of minutes I spent, but I also wasn't forcing myself to. So for that reason, I only read 2 books this month, and I'm probably not going to read a whole lot of books each month. So they're probably going to be me only talking about probably 1 to maybe 4 books, depending on length, ease of reading, so on and so forth. So I just wanted to get that out of the way to begin with, just because it does seem to be kind of standard on BookTube that you have a lot of books that you're going to be talking about, but I just don't have that time. But I still enjoy doing this, and I don't want the fact that I have a lot of other things going on, or that I'm not the fastest reader, to keep me from doing this, because I do like what I'm doing. With that being said, I do want to reformat how I do my monthly wrap-ups. Before, I didn't really have like a mold or theme to them. I just kind of talked about each book as I went with no real planning, then gave it a rating. I found that I'm more enthusiastic when I first finish a book, but I like to overthink things. So over time, my view of the book tends to change. So typically my original rating of the book, very rarely, unless it's like an absolute spectacular book that I highly rated, highly loved, unless it's that, my rating usually changes. So for that reason, I wanted to kind of stay away from ratings. I just want to talk about how I felt while reading the book, and then how I feel now about the book, if that's changed. Kind of give you some dates so you know the time period. I also just find a rating system to be really difficult, because sometimes it's like comparing apples to oranges, and you would think if this book's 2 stars and this book's 2 stars, they're of the same quality, but one may be 2 stars for one reason and one may be 2 stars for another, and I just find it very difficult to place. So I think it'd be easier for me and for you guys to understand kind of my thoughts and how I felt while reading it in order to kind of form if you want to read it. I always have such long intros, but basically there are a few bullet points that I want to talk about for each book. So I want to do a brief description of the book, or as brief as I can get it. Sometimes if a book's longer, the description's just going to be longer. That's just how it is. Then I want to talk about the moods, the themes, kind of the overall vibes of the book, just because I find that really interesting and that helps me when picking out books. And then 3, I want to talk about the pacing of the books and how that corresponded with ease of reading. I also want to talk about my feelings while reading the book. Like I said, I'm a lot more enthusiastic and more blind to the thought flaws of the character, the plot, and the overall story while reading, just because I'm very in the book and I'm not really taking a step back to think about what I'm reading per se. I'm just in the book. Since I do like collecting books and I do like to have books that I really like, I put in a would I buy it / would I keep it if I already own it, just because there are some books that I finish reading and if I don't have it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to get this book, and then I'll put it on like a Christmas list or something. Or there are some books that I finish that I'm like, I don't know if I want to keep this book. And then I want to talk about how I feel about the books now, because it has been quite a bit of time since I finished both the books I'm going to talk about today. Not a whole lot of time, but a good chunk. Then I'm going to talk about who I'd recommend the books for, maybe another story that gave me similar vibes to it, certain people I think would like the book, so on and so forth. And then finally, I'm going to talk about trigger warnings in the book. I'm going to try to avoid talking about any sensitive subjects in the stories while going through the list, but if you are interested in a book, I do want to give you any warnings for content that it may have. As someone who has read books or watched movies and been like, oh, I was not expecting this to come up. Oh wow, that messed me up just a little bit. So I don't want anyone to feel caught off guard by that. So with that being said, I read 2 books this month. I read Do No Harm by Christina McDonald, and then I read East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I think East of Eden is the book everyone knew I was reading. And September was an emotional roller coaster. It had a lot of ups and downs and a lot of really high highs and low lows. I got my cat named Piper. He is the sweetest baby boy. I'll put a little picture up here. So we've been adjusting to, life together and getting into a new routine. And then, yeah, a lot of mental health struggles this month, which is also probably contributed to my overall reading attention. I find I read less when I'm really not doing so hot, but I read more in the beginning of the decline. It's weird. If you know, you know. All right, but anyways, let's get into these books. So the first book I finished this month was Do No Harm by Christina McDonald. This book is about a mother who is a doctor and her son is diagnosed with cancer. She really isn't making that much money yet, and neither is her husband. It's not that they're new to their jobs, but they're still on the lower pay scale due to them being in it only a few years or so. So the best shot that her son has at surviving this cancer, which has a really high mortality rate, is this really expensive kind of experimental therapy, which of course insurance isn't going to cover. So our main character, our mother here, she's decides she's going to start teaming up and kind of dispensing opioids or opioid prescriptions to help drug dealers get in possession of them and sell those. Now that alone is interesting to me, but then they add another layer to it. Her husband, what he does for work is he is a detective, and there has been recently this kind of witness who is supposed to be, protected because he's going to testify against some dealers in the area, or he had information he was going to give up. Recently he was murdered, so he's been put on that case, and he's really getting involved and learning more about kind of the drugs rings and all that going around in his area, and he really has to delve into that in order to solve the case. So then we have kind of two opposites, the mom and the dad, that are playing this cat and mouse game. Overall moods, themes, vibes of the book. We obviously have this family dynamic at play. We have this ideology of doing anything for your child or your family at whatever cost. It also has this theme of kind of the American health system and how it fails the people it's supposed to be helping, which was really interesting and I think opens up a really good discussion. Definitely some dark themes. Well, dark themes, dark moods going on. This story is obviously suspenseful, keeps you on the edge of your seat. It's nerve-wracking. I feel like it was also reflective in a way, in the sense that it does kind of spark that discussion I was talking about kind of the healthcare system and who is it actually helping. I think any book that opens up a bigger discussion about an issue going on in the world, or just in general, I usually see those books as more reflective because it opens up that discussion. And then pacing wise, according to Storygraph, this book is fast paced, and I would agree with that. A lot happens in this book, and it all happens fairly quickly. The author, Christina McDonald, really wasn't afraid to use time jumps to kind of get to the important parts of the story, which, I respect. But anyways, pacing wise, especially thrilling and suspenseful books that are fast-paced, I tend to be able to fly through quicker, and it's harder for me to put down because things are always happening. It doesn't get to a point where it's kind of slow and I'm all like, okay, I'm gonna stop for now. It's more, I need to find out what happens next, like page turner type book for me, which kind of leads us into how it made me feel while I was reading it. Like I said, it's suspenseful, it's a thrilling book. I was so stressed for our main character the whole way through. There's this huge investigation, and there's no way this all goes away. There's no way this ends well. You just have that feeling throughout the whole book, and that makes you very stressed for the character, and it makes you want to read to figure out, like, how does this end? Because just how does this end for them? That's another thing. The characters in this book are written very well. Our two kind of main characters, our mom and our dad, you see a lot of their flaws and imperfections, but you also see their good intentions, their good heart, their ideals, and why they act the way they do. They're very three-dimensional and very fleshed out. And for that reason, that also made me connect to them on a deeper level. It made them feel more real. Everything in this story just feels real. As I'm reading it, I'm like, yes, I could see this happening in some small town. I call it heartbreakingly real because you're reading it and you're all like, this is absolutely tragic, but at the same time, you're like, I believe it. I believe that it is something that happens in this world, in this country. I very much was invested in this book and very much loved reading this book. It's definitely one of those I finished and I was like, 5 stars. 5 stars. I know I said I don't really like Radiance, but when there's something that you're like, this is just amazing, it's easy to go 5 stars, 5 stars. I don't own this book. I borrowed it from my library, so would I buy this book? And yeah, I would. I'd love to recommend it to my friends and be able to loan it out to them. And I'm definitely putting it on my Christmas list for this coming holidays. How do I feel now? I finished this book September 8th. It was the beginning of September. I believe it was September 8th. It is October 3rd when I am filming this. So it's been about a month since I've read it, and truly it hasn't changed a lot. I believe the story still feels very real. It's still definitely a fictional story that's dramatized by putting everything that can make it even more of a dramatic situation than it already is. But there are smaller instances where I could see like a doctor struggling to pay for her son's cancer treatment and going into selling drugs to help with that. Or certain stories about, because it goes into some customers and kind of why they're addicted, how the system failed them. Those I could definitely see as well. And then our male character, the dad, he is written so well. I don't feel like I described this as well as I could, so I'm going to describe it for you now. Basically, he sees this toxic masculinity role he's supposed to play, and he's just not made to fit that stereotype. And he finds himself truly struggling to cope with that throughout the whole book and compensate for it. His arc is amazing. I loved his arc, and I loved the writing of him just in general. If not for the brief description I gave, read it for him, because he beautifully done. I still think very highly of this book. Is it over dramatized? Maybe a little bit, but that's kind of the point of stories, isn't it? Yeah, I would throw in all those details too to make it more interesting. Do I think she necessarily had to? No. But am I glad she did? Yeah. So who would I recommend this book to? I would recommend this book to, I can think of someone very specific in my life who I think would enjoy this book. And she's more into criminal psychology and the thought process behind a criminal. Now, this isn't like criminals like murderers per se, but drug dealing is considered a crime, and it goes very deep into this like mentality and the feelings of these characters and why they're doing what they're doing. I think people who like, you know, your classic cop show, NCIS, Bones, Castle, whatever your preference is on those, I think they would enjoy this book too, since you do have the detective and the wife doing a crime and that cat and mouse aspect. I believe even people who enjoy like the really dramatized medical TV shows like Grey's Anatomy, I haven't seen it, but from what I've heard, it's very over dramatized and not very realistic of a hospital setting. But I feel like this kind of fits in with that same vibe as well. That being said, this book does contain a lot of sensitive material. It has heavy discussion of addiction and drug abuse, of course. It talks about death quite a bit. Obviously, we're dealing with cancer. There's also gun violence. There's some brief talk about suicide. You do also see a lot of characters being taken advantage of
or more vulnerable characters being used and abused, which can be a little difficult to read at times.
If you're one of the people I said you may be interested in it based off some things you may like, or if anything I said while talking about the book and kind of its themes, its description sounded interesting to you, I'll leave a link below to the book itself. It will be a link straight to Amazon. I'm not sure if it's sold in smaller bookstores, but I definitely check those first. As I'm sure many of you book lovers know, smaller bookstores do have more trouble in this landscape now that we have products like Amazon that can just deliver books to our door. So I always recommend trying to find, a smaller business or a more local bookstore to support when buying books. But if not, there's always Amazon. And then the final book I read, East of Eden. This book kind of destroyed me. And not like necessarily in a bad way. It told me a lot of things I really needed to hear at the time. Like I said, September was a fairly rough month for me. And it has a lot of fairly solid life lessons that still apply to today, and a lot of just good reminders. So this book is like 600 pages. So trying to briefly describe it is going to be difficult. So I've been thinking about how I would briefly describe this book for some time. And I think the best way I've come to describe it is we have these characters. I'm going to use the terms black and white for kind of good and evil, just because I think that analogy works best for this book. So we see a lot of characters that are black and white. You see the characters that are painted as more dark, the black characters have some similar characteristics, and the same goes for the white or the lighter characters. In the story, you see these two families that are composed of a yin and yang couple, I guess you could say. One of these couples works well together, and there's a lot of love and mutual respect for them, and they themselves are kind of on the white spectrum. Meanwhile, the other relationship, you don't really see the yin and yang, because yin and yang work well together. These two are just conflicting opposites, and their relationship as a whole is more on the black spectrum. But these two couples go to have children, and their children are where we see all the multiple shades of gray that people can truly be. And you kind of see with the couple that has the mutual respect for each other that they kind of become more gray as well, because they have that influence of each other and that respect for each other, which allows them to kind of change and adapt and evolve, if you will, from their rigid viewpoints. And I think the analogy of the gray and different shades of gray of people is the best way to describe this book. Now, this book relies on referencing the story of Cain and Abel. It basically uses that story, and it retells that story in multiple different ways with multiple different outcomes. Like I said, it's all the different shades of gray. So it shows all the different ways that, Cain could have turned out, that an Abel could have turned out, and by that means how different their story could have turned out. What this book really focuses on is the power and the freedom of choice, which is why once we've established the dark and the light characters, it really just focuses on the gray and just the wide range of options and different ways that people can play out their lives. People that have grown up in the same exact circumstances and how they turn out differently. And then it also shows people who have grown up in different circumstances and how you may expect one person to end up like this due to the circumstances they grew up in, and you expect the other person to do this due to the circumstances they grew up in, but they cross. They don't meet expectation. This book is so hard to describe, but I hope that makes sense. It's taking you through the many shades of gray that people can be based on their choices. It also, like I was touching on, has this theme of nurture versus nature, and how, yes, we may have a true nature, but it's our choice with what to do with that nature. We don't have to accept that. We can grow and change from that. And nurture, yes, you can be raised a specific way and because of it end up a certain way. But again, you have the choice to take that experience and learn from it, grow from it, or you become bitter from it. So obviously, one of the biggest themes in this book, as I've already touched on, is freedom of choice and kind of human nature and how we choose to live our lives. Another kind of theme I see throughout the book is you see a lot of chosen family, which I think is really nice, but it's these people who may not have had a very solid or very good home background, but they find these people in their life and they bond so tightly to them that they're basically family, and they'll say, I wish you were my son, I wish you were my daughter, brother, etc. And I think that's beautiful, and it also plays into that freedom of choice. No, we don't get to choose our family, but we do get to choose our chosen family and our friends and the people closest to us. I also see this interesting dynamic between self-preservation and selfishness. You see characters that are so just unfazed by the world and how it runs. There are characters in the book that really don't care about money and don't see a need with concerning themselves for it. And then there are the characters that are concerned about money. Some of them are more selfish in the sense that they want to be rich, while others do it in a sense of, we live in a capitalist society and we need to make money in order to live. That's just how it works from a self-preservation standpoint. But the characters that don't fall into either of these categories, that are more naive when it comes to how society works and don't care about money, these characters tend to group our selfish and self-preservation characters in the same vein, when they're two very different things and you see them as two very different things while reading the book. Like I said, this book heavily discusses this kind of nurture versus nature theme and how it affects people. A lot of the smaller themes in this book tie back to freedom of choice. That's the biggest theme and what most of the others tie back to. Mood-wise, it is fairly dark. It's a pretty dark book. I was not expecting it to be as dark as it was, even though I knew it was a retelling of Cain and Abel. I went to places I had no expectation of it going to. And sometimes when it went to those places, it really threw me through a loop, and I had to actually stop reading for the day and maybe take a break the next day because I was so thrown off and not expecting it to take that dark turn. But this book is very reflective. How I said earlier about books opening up a discussion, this doesn't necessarily open up a discussion with other people, but it opens up internal dialogue with yourself. Pacing wise, this book is 600 pages and it is fairly slowly paced. Steinbeck, he did time jump, but also he didn't. In the area where we would typically see a time jump, he just switched perspective and talk about a different character, which the purpose of this book is to tell multiple different retellings of basically the same story. But due to just the sheer number of characters, the number of stories being told, this book is very intensive. It does require a lot of exposition for these characters to set them up. It is very slow paced, and when you're getting through that first chunk of exposition, it can be difficult to read. But once I got into like real juicy part of the story, and when it got juicy, couldn't put it down. Absolutely obsessed. Which kind of goes into how I felt when reading it. I was obsessed with this book. If you had told me this book was written in 1952 while reading it, I would have questioned it, because for what it is, it feels so modern in a sense. And I guess that's because, you know, some things about life just don't change. The human existence stays the same fairly throughout time. We still have the same, you know, issues of guilt, self-destruction, greed, so on and so forth. But it was just so fascinating. And I felt like a conspiracy theorist. Like, I had like a whole, like, I didn't have a whole wall, but I had like a little like papers hanging up, and I'm like, this character's gonna do this, and this character's gonna do this. Like, crazy conspiracy level. Like, I needed like one of those pin boards for this book because I was obsessed. I was so just amazed by the detail and complexity of this book. And I think that's honestly the best way to describe it. I just don't have words for how well thought out, for how complex and intertwined the stories are. It's just such a beautifully done work of art. And that is truly how I felt the whole time reading it. Obviously, I own this book, and obviously I'm gonna keep it. I feel like this is a harder book to recommend since it is so long, and I feel like people, when they want a book recommendation, unless they're avid readers, don't want a 600-page book. And it's slow paced too, which makes it even harder to recommend. But I still love this book so much, I want to keep it for myself. I guess I should talk about how I feel about it now. It hasn't been nearly as long since I finished this book. I finished this book September 18th. Being able to reflect on it, I do see issues with some of the writing. In particular, there is a specific Asian character. He is of Chinese descent, but he was born in America. And he is written very, very stereotypically. Looking back on, I can look at his character and things he does and see how problematic that is and the stereotypes that it perpetuates. By making it into something lovable, it's gonna perpetuate the stereotypes even more so, especially in that time. And I'm honestly not the best person to talk about it, but I think that is one of the biggest flaws of this book, and something that kind of went unnoticed just because, like I said, he was a lovable character. I was like, oh, Lee. But that being said, I am not the best person to talk about this, obviously. So I'm going to link videos to Asian creators talking about stereotypes. I'll have one talking about stereotypes in media, and then I'll have another it's from Eugene Liang from Try Guys, but he made a really good video kind of overlaying everything historical wise. I think those videos are more well equipped to talk about it than I am, and honestly I don't feel comfortable speaking for them and don't believe I'm qualified to talk much further than I already have on the issue. So the women in this book are either angelic, sweet, just all around saints, which those characters never live, they never survive, or they're vile, manipulative, cold, unfeeling. They don't seem very affectionate. And it's a theme that I noticed after reading that didn't really sit right with me. Now, Steinbeck, I looked into him as an author, and he had 3 different wives. And I'm not saying that contributed to how he writes women, but I'm saying it is a bit suspicious that this is how he chose to portray the women in his book, considering he doesn't seem to have a good track record with them. One of the women that he wrote highly of was his mother, which, a little biased. And in my opinion, the female characters, which there's really only one I can think of, that wasn't demonized, had more, she had more I'm one of the boys type, pick me kind of energy. It rubbed me the wrong way, and I'd say that's another portion of the book that wasn't as well done. But I think the overall message and theme of the book, it doesn't override those bad things, obviously. But it does make it stand out, and I still think that the theme of the story was very well written and very well represented and very thought out. I looked into kind of Steinbeck and who he was as a person, and it seemed like he was more progressive for his time from what I read, which I think 2 weeks post-reading is interesting because this book is 70 years old and it still has, you still feel like you can relate to it. I have conflicting feelings about the book due to those issues, but I also know during the time it was written, it's definitely more progressive. So it's hard to fully praise the book, but I do admire the story and the message of the book. One book that I thought about a lot while reading this book is Lord of the Flies. So if you really like that, I would definitely recommend reading this because I think they have similar themes. I'd recommend this book for people that are feeling a little lost, a little stuck in their day-to-day life, because I think that's kind of where I was, and it helped me a lot. That being said, this book does mention suicide, murder. Obviously, it's a retelling of Cain and Abel. I don't think that one's too much of a surprise. And it has a lot of religious themes. Of course, it's a retelling of Cain and Abel. There is some talk about the church and religion in it. I do know people who are extremely adverse to Christianity and talks of it. If you fall into that group, it may not be the best book for you. And there are uncomfortable parts. Like I said, usually it's casual racism, just because that was the norm then. So my phone died. So this is a different day. This is editing me, actually. I've edited everything you've seen up until this point, obviously. I just wanted to pop in and finish out the video because it doesn't have an end to it right now. In that previous clip, I say casual racism. I call it that because people in that time who didn't consider themselves racist still spoke as they did. Like Steinbeck himself, he didn't consider himself racist, but the way he wrote about people is still what we'd consider today racist. Therefore, I termed it casual racism. Aside from that, I just wanted to say, if anything I talked about in East of Eden piqued your interest and you want to get it, since it is a classic, it is fairly easy to find in a used bookstore. I believe I got mine at like a Half Price Books or something like that. So I definitely check there for it in case you are unable, either physically, mentally. Trust me, I get it. Sometimes I can't leave the house either. If that's you, I'll leave an Amazon link in the description for it. But like I said, I definitely recommend trying those smaller shops first. Oh, this is Piper. Piper. That was my September wrap up. That's my Catagon September. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you give it a like. That lets me know you liked the video. Also, make sure you subscribe so you see when I post, because I'm currently not on a schedule. And finally, leave a comment down below on if you've read any of these books, your thoughts on them, or if I piqued your interest in any of them. Don't forget to support your local bookstore, guys. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next vid. Bye!